Hey everybody, it is the month of June, and I'm sure glad to see you. Welcome back to Patreon. Last month we skipped doing a video. I did a little bit of writing for you, but this month we're back to the video format. And this month I want to talk to you about something that has been on my mind, which is kind of some of the physics of recording. And I'm not going to get too technical with sciencey stuff, because I know a little bit about the science element of it, but I sort of know the practical applications of it that I want to share with you. And particularly, what I'm interested in is the recording of a hi-hat. Now, you guys remember that a number of months back we did a video on the hi-hat where Andrew Miller came and demonstrated all the different techniques that were available to play on the hi-hat, different sounds you could get out of it, stuff like that. But recording the hi-hat is a very unique and special thing. So, first of all, let's just talk basically about recording. The idea with recording a band, and this is kind of the same in live performance, is that you want to use as few mics as possible to get the sound. And the reason for that is that, and that is the opposite philosophy of like modern recording, totally different. Modern recording is like use as many mics as possible to get very specific sounds. But when you put a microphone up close to something, you get a different sound than what you get when it's far away. And the reason for that is, the basic reason for that is that different frequencies, the higher the frequency is, the shorter the wavelength, right? That's like a basic science thing. So high frequencies don't travel as far as low frequencies. That's why if you've ever been like, really far away from like a rock concert or something like that, like a big stadium concert, and you can hear the bass from really far away, like the low end, right? But you don't really hear the stuff up above it until you get closer, and that's because the higher frequencies don't travel as far. Okay, so with that in mind, when let's say you're playing a guitar, right? Well, if I put the mic right up against the guitar, well, what am I getting? I'm getting the sound of the guitar, but I'm not getting the sound of the guitar as it would breathe through the air, because the air is going to slowly kind of change that sound a little bit, right? Like as the sound wave propagates through the air. And by the time it reaches your ear, it's going to have propagated through the air a certain amount. It's also going to have bounced off the walls some, and those sounds are going to hit your ears. So it's going to be a very different timbre than if you stuck your head right up against the guitar and listened to it. You're also going to get things like a lot more pick noise if you're really up close against the guitar, because again, that's a higher sound than what the pitch is that the guitar is actually producing. You're going to hear the sound of the pick striking the strings. And so that's true of all instruments, right? If you get the mic really close to a saxophone, you're likely to get the sounds of the keys clicking and things like that. But just the tone itself of the instrument is also going to be different, both because as it travels through the air, it's going to lose a little bit of something, it's going to lose a little bit of the higher frequencies, and as you get more complex sounds bouncing off the walls, that's going to change the sound. Now, if your goal is to make it sound kind of like a rock concert where everything would be mic'd in concert, then yes, ideally you would want to mic everything really close in the studio. But if your goal is to try and reproduce the sound of sort of like a natural acoustic sound like a jazz band might have in concert, or a good jazz band might have in concert, where they're not miking everything up, then you want to do the same thing in the studio. So the challenge is that the further away the microphone gets from the sound source, the more the less powerful that signal is going to be on the recording, is the best way I can describe it. So you're going to get more of the ambient sound of the room, which some of that is good, but if you get too much, then it's going to just sound kind of really far away and weak. So it's a matter of finding sort of the sweet spot for the mic, or the sweet spots for the mics that you're using, to get them kind of just the right distance from things, not so far that the sound is weak, but not so close that you're only getting one instrument instead of a whole section of saxophones or something like that. What we're planning to do on this record that's coming up is we're going to do a mic for the saxes, and a mic for the brass, and a mic for the strings, because remember we're going to have a string section on this. And the guitar and the bass, the guitar is going to be seated behind the back row of the string section, which should just get you about just the right amount of guitar in that mic out ahead of it. And the bass just sort of, because it's the lowest and it's the biggest frequencies, it kind of comes through everywhere. On the last record, we had the bass and the piano on the same mic, and we ended up having to roll a lot of bass frequency out after the recording, like in the mixing phase, out of all the other mics, because it was just way too much bass. This time what we want to do is just use that bass and not have it coming into the piano mic, because in the piano mic we had some other troubles last time. We were actually getting a lot of Ian's left hand. You could hear that as his hand was striking down on the string, which happens just before you pluck it. So it sounds out of time. I mean, it's supposed to, but you don't really want to hear that, right? Again, it's one of those high frequency things where it's like, you know, fret noise on a guitar or something like that. You're not going to hear it from far away, but if you put a mic too close, you're going to hear that sound. So, on this recording, we're going to have one sax mic, one string mic, one brass mic, and then we're going to have a mic for the piano, because many of the old, 30s and 40s recordings did a mic for the piano. Now, in the 20s, for example, the way that they would record would just be one mic for the whole ensemble. And so, that would just kind of be right out front, and that would be it. So they would have to just position everything very carefully around it to get the right balance. When you got into the 30s and particularly into the 40s, they started using a few more mics in the studio, and particularly for things like, if you think about like Count Basie's sound, that very light style of piano playing, you just can't do that without miking the piano. So this was an instance of the technology affecting the way that the music was played, right? Like we have more mics available now, okay, live settings, so that's now we play this way and now we record that way. One thing I do think it's important to note is that, for many years, these guys did not mic everything. So the old guys really felt very adamantly about not miking all the instruments individually. I played a gig maybe a year or so ago with one of the bass players that played with Benny Goodman in his last days, and he said that they did a concert at Radio City Hall, and they had all these mics set up for all the instruments, and Benny made the sound guys take all the mics away. Like when he showed up, he was like, no, take all those away, and they left 3 mics on the stage to play Radio City. So I think that really shows how these guys really felt about the sound. They were particular about it. They really, even you watch the Basie band into some of those videos from the 50s and 60s, and they maybe have a section mic, but they're still not miking all the instruments. And I think that's really important, that these guys who created this music, a lot of them really very felt strongly about not miking the shit out of everything, and the way that would affect the sound. So what I wanted to talk particularly about is the hi-hat. Now the hi-hat and the other cymbals really also are the big challenge in recording this kind of music. And the reason for that is this. The frequency of the hi-hat, like the fundamental pitch frequency of the hi-hat, is like somewhere up around like maybe 2,000-3,000 hertz, right? So when you get up into that range, it's basically up above anything else. Like the clarinet tops out at, I think, maybe 1,500 or maybe 1,000 hertz. And when you get up into that range, the problem that you have is that all of the other instruments, remember, all of the instruments have overtones. We've talked about that. So when you think about we're talking about fundamental pitches right now, but all of these instruments have all these overtones that reach up above the fundamental pitches. And they're all happening at once, and that's what creates the timbre of the instrument. So if you take a clarinet and you play it, and then you record it, and then you go into the mixer in the recording, and you take out all of the high end above the fundamental pitch, even though you're not touching the pitch where the clarinet is at, if you take out all of the stuff up above it, it's going to change the way the clarinet sounds because you're changing those overtones, right? Well, on the old recordings, the hi-hat didn't dominate the recording, and in a live setting, the hi-hat doesn't dominate the band. Well, why? Well, because if you're right up close to the band, the hi-hat's actually pretty dominating. But when you're out in the house, that higher pitch, again, we discussed before, doesn't travel as far. It doesn't, right? Like the lower the frequency is, the further it's going to travel, right? The quicker the higher frequencies are going to dissipate. And so that makes the hi-hat less less present in a live setting, and it creates a good balance. Well, on a recording, if you get enough distance, if you record enough distance away from the horns that hi-hat is going to dissipate enough, then you're going to have a really distant sound on the horns. And so it's this careful balance of like trying to make it work on a recording. The hi-hat can easily dominate a recording. On the old records, it didn't do that because the nature of the equipment was that it just didn't record high frequencies as well. And that was the case for many years, even into tape. When they stopped recording the records and started going to tape, often they would talk about how like you'd listen to something when you recorded it and it sounded a certain way, and then you play it back the next day, and the tape there would be like a certain amount of, it would degrade a certain amount, especially at the high end, and it would sound darker. So engineers learned to use that and to work with it. But obviously in the 30s, you listen to a recording of a big band, and that hi-hat isn't dominating the sound. It's not bright and like overpowering other stuff. But that's largely because those frequencies were just muted on those recordings, so it sounded more natural. The problem is that we want to get a really good quality recording. We don't want to lose frequencies. We don't want to lose the upper end of the clarinet, the stuff that makes it sound richer and fuller, which they lost on those recordings, and that's why they don't, they sound less good to our modern ears, or less like what we're used to. I don't want to say less good, because that is definitely a value judgment. I think they sound better personally. But the optimal thing would be to get that high range and like the higher upper overtones with the clarinets and the trumpets and get that richer, fuller sound, but still not have the hi-hat dominate the mix. That's the challenge. So what we're going to try and do on this record is position things such that we're just not going to quite get as much hi-hat in the mix altogether, right? We may still have to dampen down a little bit of the overtones, but if you listen to my last record, it sounds like an old record, and part of that is just because we just went like, it's partly how we recorded it, and it's partly that we just went like on the high end and just dipped it down, not as much as like an old record would, which is why it still sounds better than an old record, but still has the balance. But we had to do that. There was no way with the setup that we did that we could not do that, because the hi-hats would have been overpowering. On this record, what I want to try and do is get the hi-hats where they're not overpowering, but you can't put the drummer in the next room, far away, because then it messes with the time feel of the band. We're not all close enough together. So what we're going to do with this one is set the drums up where he's kind of behind the brass, and I'm going to put the back row of brass up on a riser, and then we're going to put like a little baffle between the drums and the piano mic, right? And so what that's going to do is it's going to keep the drums out of the piano mic for the most part. They're still going to be there a little bit, and hopefully kind of keep it, put the baffle so it keeps it out of the piano and the strings until we just get it in the brass mic, but using the bodies of the guys in the brass section between the drums and that mic to kind of like absorb a little bit of this, particularly the higher frequencies. So it's using the physical space, right? Like we don't want to block the sound completely, because then we lose the hi-hat altogether. We don't want them in an isolation booth. But we want to do things that physically will block particularly some of that high end to smooth it out a little bit, make it less bright, make it less dominant in the mix. And hopefully that will, for us, achieve, we'll get a greater amount of the high end of the recording without the hi-hat dominating it. So that is like the big challenge for me. It's like finding that distance for the hi-hat, finding the right amount of bodies in between. And, unfortunately, with the way budgets work for recordings today, I mean, I would love to be able to go into the studio and spend a day just figuring that out and getting that perfect, but I have to do it really quick, which is why we've brought on a really good engineer for this this upcoming session. We're doing, Todd Whitelock is going to engineer this, who has won a bunch of Grammys and is really great. And I said to him, when I approached him about this, I said, basically, I want to bring you on to get the mics and the barriers and the guys in just the right place within the way that we need to set up to play, to put everything in just the right place so that we're getting the mix that we want in each of the mics. We're getting the hi-hat and the drums in each mic, but it's not overpowering. It's not overpowering, the brass or whatever. It's just there. It's like in the right balance to begin with, so that we're not having to mess so much with EQ to create that balance that we want, to create that sound that we want. So yeah, so that is what has been on my brain for the last few weeks, is thinking about working with the hi-hat, working with the positioning of everything in the recording to get it just right, to make it sound even better. Because I think our recordings have sounded pretty good so far, I will say, but we can always do better. And one thing I would love to do is to, people talk about how our records sound like an old record, but without like all the record noise and stuff like that. I would love to even get more of that high frequency than we get, which is more than the old records, but I'd love to even get more of it to create a richer sound without the cymbals domineering over it. So a recording you guys can check out if you want to see something really interesting. If you look up Paul Whiteman, and you look, there are a couple of recordings that he did with his band in 1933 at Bell Labs. And what's so interesting about them is that they're done in stereo. They're done with condenser mics in stereo, which is, this is like way before its time doing a stereo recording like this. There's a much higher frequency response to what they're working with, and what do you know, the cymbals are killing the recording. They're dominating the recording. Every time a cymbal clangs, you're like, whoa, cymbals, okay. Now, this was an experiment at this time, right? Like recording a big band in stereo was something new. And so, they didn't know. They didn't know that's what it was going to be. This was a test. So I think that, listening to that kind of gives you an idea of like, when you record it with like full frequency spectrum and the cymbals, it really doesn't sound like it sounds in a room if you're listening to it, because of the way the sound travels. So balancing that will be our task for this record, and I want to thank you guys for watching this month and for being supporters of the Patreon. Every few months I do one of these that I make public, so I'm going to make this month's public because I'm hoping folks will check it out and see what we're thinking about with regard to this record that's coming up, and hopefully they'll support the Kickstarter, because we got 38 days to get like another 10 grand on Kickstarter. So hopefully we get to make this record, and then I get to prove out what I'm talking to you here about the hi-hats. All right, guys, thank you again so much for supporting the Patreon. Don't forget to share this month, because I'm going to make it public, so please share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter, share it on Instagram. I don't know, is Google Plus still around, whatever you're on, just to help us get word out about the Kickstarter and the new album, and get folks helping us support that. All right, guys, thanks, and have a great rest of June. I'll see you in July.